Welcome to r/slash Prorevenge, where OP utterly destroys a cheater's life. Our next Reddit post is from Broad Ads. Way back in the early 2000s, I began to suspect that my wife was up to something. Our 2 kids were about 4 and 6, still young, but not so young that they couldn't tell you something about what had happened in their day. They started talking a lot about staying with my wife's parents during the day, which wasn't really that strange in and of itself. But since they lived about 90 minutes away, doing this 2 or 3 times a week seemed a bit much. This happened basically every day that my wife wasn't working at her part-time job. When I asked my wife about it, she denied it, but she was never a good liar. So I started tracking the mileage on her car, and sure enough, she was driving an extra 400 or so miles per week. I knew that something was going on. Then, one day, I sat down at the computer and she had left a sticky note with her AOL password written on it next to the keyboard. I couldn't resist, and I logged in to read her emails, and I saw a few email exchanges between her and her college BFF, where they discussed how my wife was regularly screwing one of her ex-boyfriends from high school. My wife didn't mention any details about the guy, except for my wife also talking trash about the guy's wife, making fun of how she had gotten fat after having kids. Anyways, I printed out these email exchanges and stashed them. I still needed to know the details, so I called a friend who was a cop, and he suggested I call a guy that he knew that had left the force to become a private investigator. This PI, Ron, was great. I paid his retainer, gave him the emails, and what little I knew about my wife's activities, and he figured out exactly what she was doing. His report, detailed with photos and times, dates, locations, all about how she would take the kids to her parents, then go meet this guy for lunch. Then they'd go to a dumpy motel for a few hours, after which she'd pick up the kids and return home. At this point, I hired a divorce lawyer. My parents cheated on each other, and the fallout absolutely destroyed mine and my siblings' childhood. So this was something that was totally unacceptable. I also asked Ron to find out what he could about this guy. Ron absolutely came through. I learned the other guy's name, Bob, that he was married and had 3 kids. I also found out that he worked as a VP of sales for his father-in-law's business. At this point, I had my lawyer draw up the divorce papers. I also asked Ron for a couple more copies of his report, and there was one more thing I wanted him to do for me. On the day that I had my wife served with divorce papers at her work, I had Ron meet with this guy's wife and show her everything that he'd found out. She seemed nice, and I figured that she deserved to know what her dear hubby was up to. What she did with that information was up to her. While the information about my wife's infidelity didn't really matter in my divorce proceedings, Bob's wife did a real number on him. According to the publicly available court documents from the divorce and other related proceedings, she cleared out their joint account, took the kids, and left. As soon as her dad found out what he'd done, Bob was fired, and since her parents actually owned the house where Bob and his wife lived, he also got evicted. Their divorce was ugly. Lots of fighting in and evidently out of courts. I guess Bob went to the house and started arguing with his wife, and it escalated to the point that her brother stepped in and Bob got his nose broken. There were restraining orders, a few more incidents with police reports, criminal charges, jail time, and so on. I can't find Bob on the internet anywhere these days. Last I heard, he left the state, and his ex-wife did okay. She went to work at her dad's company and took over after he retired. As for me, my ex and I got along well enough. I don't engage with her on anything that wasn't related to the kids, and now that our kids are both adults, I don't talk to her at all anymore. I don't hate her or anything, but I only care in the context that she's my kid's mom and important to them, but nothing beyond that. Brutal. I mean, deserved, but brutal. Lost his wife, lost his house, lost his job. Our next Reddit post is from Maximum Power. Back when metered on-ramps were first installed on the main highway in my town in Oregon, the interval between lights on the ramp I used daily was 15 seconds. Cars would be backed up onto the adjacent feeder streets, and you could be stuck for 15 to 20 minutes on the ramp waiting for the light. It took a bit of research to find out that it wasn't the city or the county, it was the Oregon Department of Transportation that controlled these lights. After repeated complaints and no action, I finally got the names of the 2 ODOT traffic engineers responsible for setting the light intervals. I made numerous voicemails and finally had one discussion, but still no fix to the issue. Well, back in the day, we still had phone books, and both these engineers had listed home phone numbers. So I got a 4x8 piece of plywood and wrote on it, "Tired of these idiotic ramp lights? Call the ODOT engineers responsible for them. Dennis at such and such number and Bill at such and such number. And let them know what you think." I stood with the sign on the side of the ramp for 2 days during rush hour, 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. The next day, I got a call from one of them begging me to stop. I said, "Fix the f***ing lights." "You'll stop with the sign?" "Fix the f***ing lights." "Okay." The very next day, they had a survey crew out there in the afternoon to count cars. And the day after that, the lights were reset to 3 seconds between cars. So, bottom line, when dealing with the government, until those personally responsible are held accountable in a manner that inconveniences or scares them, they will continue to abuse the public, whether from negligence, incompetence, or malice. But bring it home to them and they will grudgingly change their ways. Our next Reddit post is from Jar Jar Binks. I used to work at a medium-sized IT service company and had recently been moved to a smaller branch office with a nice pay raise. I was basically my own team and got to do interesting work on a large project. Since the company was satisfied with the work but needed it done on a larger scale, the company hired another person to help me. Meet Fred. I knew Fred from outside work through common relationships, and I didn't find him any weirder than the other nerdy people already in the business. Oh boy. Fred was good at technical work. Very good. When it came to human interactions, though, Fred was something else. Fred thought of me as his only friend in the workplace and would complain all day long about our other colleagues, who were all equally incompetent, weird, evil, and generally deserving of his scorn. Fred had a terrible tendency of telling other people that we had to work with that they were doing things wrong and that their software was garbage, which was often technically correct, but completely forgetting the constraints in which other people had to work. And there might have been reasons for things that now sounded awful. People resented both of us as a team for things that he said, and some situations became entrenched. It was getting harder every day for me to get to work. Eventually, Fred made a lot of enemies, and he got a meeting with the division director. It only lasted for a few minutes, during which Fred told the boss of 800 people that he was an evildoer. That was his last day at the company. I worked alone from that time and managed to finish most of the project, while smoothing things over with the other teams. A few months later, I got an offer for the job of my dreams in a huge utility company. After starting the work, guess who I discover working right here as a contractor under my direct supervision? Fred. Fred looked so happy to have a friend again. He spent most of my first day at work telling me how the company was awful, everyone was dumb, and everything was insufferable. I went home that night feeling horrible, wondering how much of what he told me was true and how bad it would be to work there. Turns out, after a few hard starting days, it really was the job of my dreams. Acting now with Fred as a client and not a colleague, I managed to keep him in check and to improve a lot of perceived quality with the team's work. Prior to my hiring, Fred basically told people to screw off whenever they asked him to do things that he didn't want to work on. Having someone who could see through his BS to manage him got the roadmap back on track. Eventually, I learned that my colleagues had been very wary about working with me at the beginning, because Fred had been bad-mouthing me from the day that he learned that I'd been hired to manage him. This had made my first few weeks difficult, until everyone understood that Fred had been lying about everything. About 2 years later, I was now team manager, and my boss comes in my office and asks me about a hiring issue. There's a new position on the team, and the recruiter asked him about someone with excellent technical skills, but who sounded very arrogant. Guess who wanted to work as my colleague again? If you followed the story, you got it right. I didn't let out to my boss that I had the slightest bit of resentment. I explained how Fred was a very competent person, but that he might just lack a bit of the skills required for our company's teamwork. I knew exactly what I had to say to my boss for him to never want to hire Fred, ever, without me making it about our personal history. I later mentioned this to another close coworker who sounded very thankful to hear that he would not have to work with Fred as a colleague. A few months later, his company lost the contract and Fred was hired by the new contractor. However, they weren't as lenient with him as the previous company was, and another few months later, I was finally Fred-free. Last I heard of Fred, he was working at some Silicon Valley giant, on a project that was in a worldwide media shitstorm over technical issues. I keep wondering whether he was telling everyone else in his team how bad at their job they were, and how much he contributed to that massive failure. Our next Reddit post is from Deadly Gerbil. Many years ago, when I worked for a rent-to-own company in a small town, there was a little apartment complex which we made frequent deliveries to, and just as frequently had to repo from. It had been a motel when it was built, and the owner turned it into apartments by just cutting doorways into the walls between rooms, putting a kitchen and living room in one and a bedroom in the other. The place was very run down and apparently pretty inexpensive, and based on a few things customers said, it seemed that the majority of the tenants moved in there for a short time. Between deliveries and pickups, we were visiting this place multiple times per month. But the landlord wouldn't let us park the truck in the parking lot to do it. It was a motel parking lot, so there was way more space than the tenants needed, and plenty of room for our truck. But the minute we pulled into the lot, the landlord would come running out of the office and yell at us to get the truck off his property. We were still allowed to deliver and such. We just had to carry the couches and other stuff across the gravel lot from a truck parked on the street. It was more than a little annoying. Then, the day came that I was visiting some customers, a young couple, to have them sign an extension because they couldn't make their payment, and I saw an eviction notice on their door. I knocked, they answered, and then they too saw the notice. They explained that they needed the extension because they were behind on rent, but the eviction was unexpected because they were only 2 days late with rent. The notice gave them 1 week to move out. They signed the extension and I left. A little suspicious because that didn't seem right to me. A few days later, I got a call from the couple saying they needed to return the stuff they'd rented because they were being evicted and had to move to a motel. I told them to wait there. I'd be over in an hour. My wife had worked in the rental office of our previous apartment complex, so I knew some tenant laws. When I checked after getting the extension signed, I found that evictions couldn't be served with only a 1-week notice. They had to give 30 days for the tenants to pay or move out. If they moved out, the landlord could take any unpaid rent out of their security deposit. Normally, I'd have considered this none of my business, but everyone in our store hated that landlord and wanted to get back at him. So I printed out the applicable rental law pages from the town's website and drove over to the apartment complex. Then I knocked on the doors of every one of our customers living there, which was about half of the 20 or so apartments, and I gave them copies of the law. While doing this, I learned that the landlord had been evicting people like that for being just a day late, then keeping their deposits, citing the very law that I was giving to my customers, just not the part about the 30-day leeway. He charged rent in advance. You would pay for next month, this month. So people were losing their deposits over being 1 day late. On top of that, the landlord wouldn't accept late payments, even if they were before his scheduled eviction time, because he made more money by evicting people and moving someone new in since he kept both deposits. I told the couple that started all this that if I were them, I wouldn't move out, and I'd contact a lawyer or at least the city housing department and file a complaint. They were worried because the landlord had said that he'd have the sheriff department evict them if they didn't move out in time. But I said that even if the landlord called them, I doubted they would actually evict them if they cited the law. That was all I could do, but I hoped that it would be enough. It was. The couple came in a few weeks later to pay for their rental furniture and to thank me for all my help, telling me the landlord had just been arrested. They'd filed a complaint, and when the landlord called the sheriff to evict them, it kicked off an investigation. I never learned what exactly the charges were or what happened to the landlord, but the complex ended up under new ownership, and the new manager had no problem with us parking on their property for deliveries. Also, the number of our repos and deliveries there suddenly dropped because people were no longer being evicted constantly. Between that experience and other stories I've read online, I never cease to be baffled and annoyed that people don't know their rights as tenants. Check your laws. Don't take a landlord's word for anything, and stand up for yourself. Our next Reddit post is from Peanuts or Weaknuts. My mother-in-law is a pretty well-off woman. She owns a large number of rental properties, and her husband have a huge house located just outside of New York City. It's got an indoor pool, sauna, elevators, etc., and is worth well into the 7 figures only 5 minutes down from downtown Manhattan. Sadly, her husband passed away and she remarried and moved out of state. She put up the house for rent shortly after. A broker approached her with 2 prospective tenants. The tenants were music producers and had some legit acts that they worked with. One of them was the business guy and the other was the talent. The talent guy I'll call Ben. The 2 were partners in the beginning, and the business guy made sure the rent was paid on time. He was legit and did not screw around. They used the house as a place for artists to chill out and work on their music. After a couple of years, the business guy and Ben had some sort of falling out, and the business guy left, but Ben stuck around. At first, he continued to pay the rent on time, but after a few months, it kept getting later and later. By itself, this wasn't the worst thing. Owning real estate, it comes with the territory. But he started getting aggressive and racist as my mother-in-law insisted that she needed to be paid. My mother-in-law is not a mean person and values politeness and manners above all else. Finally, my mother-in-law had enough and had the guy evicted. After the eviction, they went through the house and assessed over $100,000 in damages. Cigarette burns in the carpet, stains on the wall, pool filters and plumbing damage, etc. She took him to court, won, and had a lien placed against all of his property. Ben was dead broke at this point, aside from his home, and she just didn't see the point in trying to get blood from a stone, so she just moved on. Fast forward about 15 years. My mother-in-law receives a notice in the mail that the bank is foreclosing on Ben's home. Because she had a lien placed on all his assets, the bank was asking a judge to dismiss her lien so they could collect what they were owed from the sale of the home. My mother-in-law was obviously going to contest this, but then she got clever. She approached the bank and basically said, "Look, sell me the house at fair market value minus what I'm owed, and you'll save on foreclosure costs, brokers, lawyers, etc. I have cash on hand, and it's a win-win for everyone." The bank agreed, and she purchased the house for almost 25% below market value. Mind you, that 25% was money that she was owed anyways, but still, she didn't think that she would ever see it again. Of course, given all of Ben's butthole behavior, she wasn't going to just take the house without having Ben know who was going to take the house. So she made sure to find out the day that Ben moved out and stopped by. Ben had a bit of difficulty placing her. It had been over a decade since they last spoke. But once he realized who she was, he basically cussed her out. She never said a word, just smiled. She has since rented out his home to a lovely family with no issues. That was r/Prorevenge, and if you like this content, check out my podcast where I publish the exact same episodes. Also, hit that subscribe button because I put out new Reddit videos every single day.